Unbroken, healing through storytelling.
Hello and welcome to Unbroken, the podcast Healing Through Storytelling with me, Madeleine Black. I am passionate about sharing other people's stories because I really believe in the power that comes when we share our stories. And I think if they're heard at the right time in someone's life, it has the power to transform. Let me tell you about today's guest. Today, I'm going to speak to Shari Botwin. She has been counselling survivors in recovery from trauma and abuse for over 25 years in her South Jersey practice. Her second book, which I have read, Thriving After Trauma, Stories of Living and Healing, is a compilation of patient stories and some about her own recovery after surviving childhood sexual abuse. Shari has just launched a podcast, Warrior Women Speak, with a former guest of mine, Judge Rosemarie Aquilina. So welcome to the show, Shari. How lovely to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So because the show is called Unbroken, the first question that I always ask all of my guests is, what does the word unbroken mean to you?
I mean, I love the word. I've been thinking about it, trying to think, how do you best describe that? It has sort of like a sad feeling to it, but the way I look at it is unbroken, meaning you can't ruin me.
Yeah.
You can't damage me. You might have hurt me, but whatever you've done to me, it's not going to stick with me forever.
Yep. And as I said in the bio, the intro, I have just finished reading your book, and that's just perfect for you. Whatever you've gone through, it did not ruin you in any way. You are not in spite of it, but you are strong, and not just strong for yourself, but strong for all the people that you work with. But we're not here to talk about their stories at the moment. I'm more interested in your story. And so from a very young age, even as young as 5 years old, you always felt kind of hopeless, didn't you? You felt like a misfit.
I knew something wasn't right, especially when I was around kids my own age. I always felt like I was on the outside looking in, and I never understood why, but it was a through the year feeling, and it's a feeling that I lived with every day. So, what I decided from a very young age was rather than just accept that this is how I feel, I decided that when I was ready, I was going to figure out why that was so.
And did you ever figure that out?
I mean, it took me, I would say, until I got into my late 20s, early 30s, once I got myself into treatment and I started confronting and letting myself know what happened to me. It was almost like the puzzles were all over my house. And within months, I took all those pieces and I've started to put them together.
Yeah, because we were speaking a little bit before we started recording about the power of denial and the power of pushing everything down. You know, you really had no conscious memory or awareness of what was taking place, despite the evidence.
You know, what was really difficult for me too was the abuse took place when I was asleep.
Yeah.
I was always asleep. So, being that I didn't have memories of things happening to me during the day, it almost made it more complicated because I'm so vulnerable and I'm not awake. And then I think as soon as the abuse started to happen, I just kept myself asleep. I found a way to take my body and my heart out of the experience so that I didn't have to know it the
Yeah.
next day. And I think, again, we have words now, but when you're growing up, especially back then, people weren't talking about incest, people weren't talking about sexual abuse. So I didn't even know what to call, not just what was being done to me, but what I felt in my body after, because that's part of what happened for me. I didn't just remember what was done to me, I remembered what I felt in my body the day after.
Yeah, because there was one very powerful line when you are in your 20s and you go for therapy and you meet your therapist, Dorothy, and you say, somebody that I really trusted was inside of me. And it is a very powerful line, really, isn't it? A powerful statement.
And what's interesting about it is I felt that feeling in my body for years. And when I sat in therapy, I think because I felt safe, I started to actually experience the beginning of the rape whenever I thought Dorothy was even slightly like a tiny bit annoyed or disinterested or I didn't trust her. I would start to feel that. So I think what happened was my body told me, let me feel what happened so then I could speak it.
Yeah. I absolutely believe that our memories are not just held in our mind, but they are held in our body as well, which is why we physically feel it. People that know my story will know I'm also a survivor, and I literally felt it in my body when I was in therapy as well. But one of your ways of coping when you were just that little girl was that you turned to food, wasn't it?
Loved it. Food, I really believe, even though I felt shame about it for the longest time, now that I've been working with people in recovery from eating disorders and I've done so much work in my own recovery, I think food is one of the best things that could have ever happened to me.
Yeah.
It was one of those things where I could turn to it and I could have it be my secret. I could use it in a way that would make me feel better. There were times when I felt so hopeless and so despondent, but then I thought about, yeah, but I want to be able to eat dinner tonight.
But then at school, I believe when you started to put weight on from eating, that the kids started to bully you as well. They started to call you names.
The thing about kids, as much as I love them, they can be so flippin' mean. And
Yes.
when I think about it now, I think if anybody ever talked like that to my kid, or if I ever heard my kid talk like that to somebody else's kid, I would be so pissed off.
Yeah.
I think that the kids picked on me because again, I didn't stand out in my weight. It was more that I stood out in my vulnerability and in my being like a victim. And I think what happened was, even though the bullying was incredibly painful, it didn't stop me from continuing to have the food there when I needed it. I still used it when I needed it because it was the only thing that I had.
It was just sadness, I guess, reading it, that, at home you felt helpless or hopeless, and at school you were a bit of a misfit as well. And, I just wondered, where did you fit in? It seemed like food was your only comfort for you.
It was food and it was also theater. When
Yes.
I was very young, I started dancing. I started taking dance class probably around the age of 4 or 5. And whenever I was on the stage, I still remember my first dance recital. I'm like having a flashback now as we're talking about it. And I think I was in first or second grade. I remember the lights were shining on the stage. We were doing a dance to some Barry Manilow song. I can't remember the name of
One
it.
of the first albums I ever bought was a Barry
Ah!
Manilow. Golden Magic, there you go.
I can't think of the name of the song. It's going to drive me nuts. But I remember the light shining on the stage, and I felt this sense of happiness and freedom that I didn't normally feel. So I also found that outlet from a very young age, and I continued to dance and got involved in musical theater as a young teenager. So I had that also, and that really was so freeing and helpful. And it was sort of another way for me to remind myself my life will be better when I get older. It's going to get better because a lot of the shows that I did were I played the role of either teenagers or adults.
So there was always this belief that things can change and things can get better.
I used to say to myself in the fourth grade, which is the age of my little guy now, I used to stand at the top of the blacktop. All the kids are out playing, and I'm standing there feeling like a total mess up. And I used to say to myself, someday somebody will hear you.
Yeah.
Someday. And that someday was the word that I used because it was a word that was about hope and future and positivity.
And it's interesting, those words, someday somebody will hear you, because you stayed quiet. You couldn't find your voice to tell anyone, could you?
I stayed quiet, but I also spoke. I might not have said directly to anybody, awful things are happening to me. But when I started to become an early adolescent, I started therapy. I was telling my therapist that I didn't want to live anymore. I was writing things down. I was throwing journal entries in trash cans where I knew teachers were going to see it. So I think it's sort of a little bit of both. I did the best that I could. When I go back and I look through the years at different people that were in my life, that was one of the things that I had to work through in recovery. Not just the betrayal I felt at home, but I felt betrayed by some of the people who I felt as though I tried to tell, especially the therapist that I was seeing. His response was, if you keep talking like that, then you're going to have to go away somewhere. That was his response. And his plan of action was to get my family in the sessions. And he would have me sit down with my family and say, you need to spend more time with them. You need to make an effort. And the last thing I want to do is spend time with somebody that's sexually assaulting me. So it was awful.
And that's really hard to hear, that there's no understanding from this professional at all.
None. And you know what I did? When I was in my early 30s, when I started uncovering, I went back and I got all my medical records. I got the notes from the therapist because he was still in practice. His office was 2 blocks from Dorothy's office. I got all my records from all of my doctors, my pediatrician. I went through and I looked at different times when I was having infections and I was just not okay. And I wanted to see if anybody documented any suspicion of abuse. It was so important to me, and I wanted to see what this therapist thought. What was this therapist saying that was wrong? The therapist at the time said I had dependent personality disorder. You can't have a personality disorder when you're 12 years old. You can't die. I mean, I know this now as a therapist, but while it was really upsetting to see all that and read it, I was at a point in my life where I could see it and I could figure out what to do with that information. At least gave me an opportunity to say to myself, this was another person that didn't listen
Yeah.
to me. This was another person that should not have been part of my whatever treatment my parents were trying to provide me.
It's very blinkered. It's almost as if they don't want to believe it. You know, people struggle because that can't possibly be happening. You know, you come from a nice family, whatever, or they've met your parents and they'd made up their mind without really hearing what you had to say. But there was evidence which was hard to read in the book about the unwanted pregnancies and the miscarriages. And every time you were asked, is there a possibility that you could be pregnant? And you would just say no, but you were having a miscarriage. And I think people will find that hard to understand, how we can just block that off from our minds.
People used to say to me when I used to try to talk to some friends about my process of recovery, they used to say to me, how could you not know that? And at the time, I think it would throw me into shame attacks because I felt
Yes.
like, well, if they're saying that to me, then I guess I should have known. But what I've learned is that our minds protect us from things that we can't possibly know or understand. If I were to let myself know I was pregnant, then I would have to say who it was because I never was with anybody. I
Yeah.
didn't have boyfriends. I wasn't sexually active. So I think again that with something like a pregnancy, it's not just something that happens overnight. It was a very gradual process. And from a young teenage age, I started developing symptoms of anorexia. So, talk about complicated. Anorexia is all about trying to control what I'm putting into my body. It's my way of trying to control my weight. But even with anorexia and those symptoms, I still had a little belly. I still had symptoms of pregnancy. And I think for me, the hardest part when I look back is what I felt during the miscarriages. What actually happened. I ended up in the ER one time. I ended up having to have surgery months after a miscarriage because the miscarriage didn't finish. I didn't fully evacuate all of the remnants of the pregnancy. So then I spent weeks trying to deal with not just the miscarriage, but the unraveling, the unfolding of what happened in my body. And I didn't understand it until I went to therapy and I started putting it all together.
Yep. And I think a lot of people still assume that anorexia, bulimia is just about how we look. You know, they don't understand that actually, well, for me, I've been anorexic. It was the only thing I could control. I couldn't control all these crazy negative, dark thoughts in my head, but I could control what I ate. And that gave me my focus and it took me away from my memories of having been gang raped.
It also helps you to not feel.
Yes.
People say, I want to be thin. It's all about my weight. When you're restricting or when you're obsessing about what you're eating or you're overeating or you're binging and purging, it doesn't allow you to access your emotions because you can't be clear in your mind and body when you're destroying it.
Yeah.
So this is something again that while I didn't understand it growing up. This is why I went into this field, because my first job out of my master's program was at a renowned eating disorder center, and I was sitting with patients who were talking about not just being anorexic or bulimic, but also having been gang raped, having been sexually abused by a family member, living through different types of trauma. So it was so clear to me that there's this connection between the two. And I think that most people who have struggled with eating disorders have gone through something that they couldn't digest or couldn't understand at the time. And this is where the eating disorder, this is sort of how it comes out.
Yes, no, I read that, when you were working with these people, this is when you started to understand, but it also triggered you though, didn't it? It wasn't easy working with these people because you had to face your own stuff and you're like, well, what's going on? And that's when you decided to go for therapy yourself, wasn't it?
It was almost, it was almost like a whirlwind, a head spinner. I would drive home at night and think, what in the world is happening anyway? Like, I need to get some help. This is what I used to say to myself when I would drive home from Renfrew, which is where I worked. I would say it every day. I need help. Like, and the thing is, I loved the job. It wasn't like I couldn't do the job. At that time, I wasn't doing individual therapy. I was sitting with patients at meals. I was sitting in groups. I was running groups. And I just decided that I have to do something. And I don't think I knew then how important it was that I get myself into therapy. And when I think about it now, I think it saved my life, because I was more suicidal then than probably earlier times when I would have thoughts of suicide. I was more suicidal when I started working at this center, because at that point, the memories are starting to break through.
Yeah, you're getting overwhelmed, aren't you? And they kind of come at you and you're like, well, I can't control these anymore. But I do believe that memories come back when we're ready to face them. Whether we believe that or not doesn't matter, but they do come back when actually we're strong enough and ready to face them. And working with your clients triggered that for you.
I mean, in some ways, deciding to go into the field, while it was incredibly stressful and difficult, I really do believe it's one of the things that helped me to save my own life. The transference, the feelings I would have when I would sit in groups with people who were talking about abuse or even traumas that I couldn't relate to. I was working very closely with a young woman who was hearing impaired, and her main trigger to her eating disorder was that she couldn't hear. So I was her interpreter for 4 weeks. So I followed her. I sat with her in her sessions. I followed her from group to group. And there was so much that I felt I could relate to as she shared her story, that I really do believe if I hadn't ended up in that job, I don't know what would have happened. I think I would have ended up I don't think I would have worked in the eating disorder field. I think I would have worked with kids because I love kids. But that is something I'm very grateful for.
Yeah. So you started therapy, but it wasn't until you were 25 that you met the therapist that really turned it all around for you, didn't you? You met Dorothy, as you referred to her in your book.
I met Dorothy, and she was the second therapist that I met. I met one therapist before her, and I will never forget this, because people ask me all the time, how do you know what to look for in a therapist, or how do you find a therapist that's really going to be able to deal with trauma? This therapist, as we were ending the session, said, can you give me a hug? And I felt sick. I thought, can I give you a hug? So it took me a little bit of time after that session to sort of get the courage. And the only reason why I went to see Dorothy is because her name kept coming up in the treatment team meetings. There were other patients that were referred to Renfrew that were working with her. And I thought, well, people talk very highly of this woman, so let me go meet her. And, from there, after 2 to 3 sessions, I knew I was in the right hands.
My thoughts are still with this one that asked for a hug. Was that for them or was that for you?
Oh, it was definitely for them, because
That's
she said
strange.
to me, can you give me a hug? Not can I give you a hug, can you give me a hug?
So you had to comfort your therapist.
I didn't do it though.
But that's almost what she's asking, really, isn't it?
And that's the thing, when you come from a family where there's abuse, the idea of boundaries, it's one of the, this is one of the biggest issues. So at least I say to myself, I had enough insight at that point to know, I didn't know what the word boundaries meant, but I knew she didn't have any. I just didn't use those words. And I thought, I'm not doing that.
Well, I know it as a psychotherapist as well, but also as a survivor, I would avoid touching people. I also had this very warped feeling that if I touch people, I could contaminate them with my badness because, it happened to me because I was obviously really bad. I know now that's rubbish. It's just what my mind did with it. So I would avoid touching people because I thought I could infect them and then they would be filled with it. So I couldn't bear people to touch me. Now it is very different. I am a hugger and I miss hugging because of Corona days. But yeah, that's very interesting.
But you know what though? Good for you, because again, I used to struggle with that too. It's like almost, it's the shame. It's the part of us
Yes,
that feels like we're gross, we're disgusting. It's not us, it's what was done to us. So,
absolutely.
yeah,
And so things got to look a lot better for you, but then in your mid-30s, you developed thyroid cancer, didn't you?
it it really did suck. I have to say,
Yeah.
it was such a disappointment, because at that point I had started dating. I was in my own practice. I had lost somebody to cancer, but had been a couple years, so I was sort of like on the right path. I had a dog that I was totally in love with. I had a great life. And the sad thing about it, it makes me very sad when I think about it, but because I was sort of newer in my recovery, I said to myself, the reason you got this cancer is because you opened your big fat mouth, especially because of where it was. You know, the meaning of
Yes.
thyroid cancer and having to have the surgery done on my throat, and the idea that when they said to me you may not be able to talk after the surgery, it took me a long time to really take that thought and throw it out the back door. But
Good.
that's really what I thought. I thought that I was the reason that I got it.
Yeah, isn't it
So sad.
hard what we do to ourselves?
It breaks my heart. And this is the thing about my work that drives me nuts, because I see so many people struggling with the shame. The thing that I value about my life at this point is I understand the role of the shame. I understand the purpose that it serves, but the suffering that we have to go through when we're trying to work through it, I shouldn't have thought like that. I didn't. How can I cause cancer inside of my own body?
You can't, but people, as we know, they're drowning in shame. Drowning, but it's good that you now see it for what it was. And so then you decide you're getting near to 40 that you want to be a mama. You want to have a child. So can you tell us about that process of
Uh,
having your Andrew?
It's so funny because it's what, 10:30? I already miss him. He just left an
Oh,
hour and a half ago, and I'm like,
oh.
where is he? When is he coming back? I decided probably in my late 30s that I really wanted to have a family, and at that point I was not dating. The best thing that came out of deciding that I wanted Andrew Botwin is that when I went to meet with the fertility doctor, because I decided I was gonna adopt, but then when I heard about the process and that it could take years and very expensive, and I wanted to have a pregnancy. I thought, why am I going to adopt? Maybe I should try to just have my own pregnancy. If I couldn't have a pregnancy, I would have adopted. So I met with a fertility doctor when I was 38. I wasn't ready yet. I wasn't ready yet to start, but I wanted to find out, what do I need to do if I decide? We sat down and we went through my entire history. I talked to her about these miscarriages. I said to myself, I said, Shari Botwin, if you go in there and you meet with this doctor, you need to be totally upfront and honest with her about your history. Not thinking anything into it, just saying you've really got to tell her. After I started talking to her about the miscarriages, which she was very affirming and she was very supportive, she said to me, listen, there's some tests that I need to run. And I looked at her like, what in the heck is she talking about? She said, even though, pregnancy by an abuser, that it can end in a miscarriage, I'm concerned about the amount of miscarriages that you actually had. So I looked at her and I thought, oh, she knows what she's talking about. So she said, I want to run a test for a clotting disorder. It's a disorder that will lead to miscarriage unless you're treating you're treating yourself with blood thinners. And I thought, it's a blood test, whatever. I'd never heard the word. It was called prothrombin factor 5. These words were like, what the heck does this mean? about 5 days after she ran the test, I was standing in my office about to see a patient, and I got the call from her, and she told me, you have this disorder. The thing that was so hopeful about it is, if I hadn't spoken to her about the abuse, if I didn't tell her about those miscarriages, she would not have run that test. I would have tried to get pregnant, and I would have had miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. So I
Yeah.
think that was a turning point for me.
Yeah. And I also think, I'm sure you will agree, the more we tell people, professionals, whoever we tell, it dilutes the impact it has on us. Yeah, but when
Absolutely.
we give it oxygen, it takes, because it occupies so much space inside. And when we release it by sharing it and speaking about it, it can't occupy the same amount of space inside of us.
I mean, I love how you say that. That's a beautiful way to say it. And I think it's also an opportunity for us to have a witness, to
Yes.
not have to sit in our memories by ourselves, but to have somebody who's neutral, just be able to affirm, what it is that we're thinking, or what we're trying to deny, or understand or not understand. It was such a turning point for me. And when I found that out, I didn't start trying to get pregnant for a year, because I needed to give myself time to deal with the news that she gave me, and I needed to meet with doctors to understand, what does this actually mean? What am I going to have to do to have a pregnancy? So I did all that before I started trying to get pregnant.
And you had to inject yourself, didn't you, for quite a
I
while?
did twice a
Yeah.
day. Yep.
Oh, yeah. But then little
So
Andrew
worth it.
Botwin was born. How old is he now?
So worth it. He is now 10 and a month.
Oh, it's a double numbers. It's very exciting, isn't it?
Yes, we had double digit birthday in March.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And I imagine it must have been a life changer for you, knowing that you can have somebody love you and you can love them back after you've been through an abusive childhood is just huge, isn't it?
It
People
is so
can't begin to understand it if they've never been in that situation.
It's so incredibly healing. The one thing I will say, and I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, who's has a baby. Once we have children, the level of knowing of what happened to us, it goes up by like 10 notches.
Yeah.
I know that I've been abused as a child, but what I don't know until I have Andrew is the impact. I don't fully understand the vulnerability of a child until I'm in the role of a parent, and I see that this little boy has absolutely no control. He's going to do whatever I tell him.
Yeah.
He's looking to me for protection. So I think that piece, just the recognition of how small and helpless I was. There are times when motherhood can be painful, but those
Yes.
are just moments.
Yeah. And it must make you kind of, I don't know, grieve or be sad when you look at how good he is and how your relationship sounds brilliant, how you never had that, because we are sponges, as you say, and we soak it all up as when we're little people. He's soaking up all the goodness, you soaked up all the badness.
This is how I do it. I don't know if your listeners will be able to relate to this, but this is the way I cope. When I watch him skipping down the hall in school, there were times when he was younger, we had to go to the school to pick up his books or go to a basketball game. And this kid, he has such a zest for life. I mean, he skips and hops and sings and whistles. So he's skipping and hopping down the hall in the first grade one day when I think we had a teacher parent conference. And for a minute, I thought, oh my gosh, look at the difference. Like, this was what it was supposed to be like. So what I did is I take the memory and I hold it on the left side of my brain, and I take the image of Andrew and I put it on the right side and I put it together.
Yeah.
I say to myself, don't just go over to the memory, have the memory, and then look at where you are now and integrate it.
It's beautiful because that's about holding it all, isn't it? Holding it all. One hand does this and the other hand does that. And it's everything. We can always find the awful things in life. We can always find the beautiful things in life. But can we hold them both and integrate it, as you say? So what has been the greatest lesson, do you think, from motherhood, becoming a mum?
I think the greatest lesson is that you, as a parent, but not even just as a parent, as a person, we are capable of living a full life, no matter how bad, how awful or horrible, whatever trauma you lived through. it is possible to not to do both, to be able to recognize and acknowledge what happened to us, but to be fully present and have all the things in our lives that we want today.
Absolutely. And so just before we speak about your book, you started writing for newspapers, didn't you? And you started really writing about trauma and its impact on people for Philadelphia Inquirer. Is that right?
So yes, what I did was I started writing for the Inquirer around the time when Bill Cosby
Yes.
was arrested. I started writing more about speaking out. I started opening up more about my history. And I didn't know at the time that I was starting to prepare to write this book. But I think what happened was once I started hearing from other survivors the impact of my words, that, that just sort of gave me a whole bunch of energy. And I thought,
Yes.
listen, I need to write this book. And I would drive home from work for years and say, I need to write about this because there's so many stories. It's not just my story. There's so many stories of hope. And you know this as a therapist, being able to witness other people prevail and overcome
Yeah.
is so uplifting and freeing. And I think because I love to write and I like to speak, it just sort of made sense.
Yeah. I want to get onto your book, but I'm really interested about what was it like to attend both of Bill Cosby's trials?
Yeah, I was at everything. I was at both trials. I went to the jury selection. I was at sentencing. At the time, I mean, it was amazing. It was empowering to be able to sit with people and watch women tell their stories and not give in to his intimidation, because Bill Cosby, when he sat in that courtroom, he was very intimidating.
Yes.
He laughed a lot.
And no remorse ever.
None.
And very arrogant in his face, you could see the energy of him, like, so what, kind of.
He could have cared less. And
Yep.
it was interesting that his supporters were not his family. His wife maybe came to walk him into the courtroom, but he didn't have family members sitting in the courtroom. One of the actors from Cosby was at the trial for the first day, and that was it. So it was interesting for me to watch this all unfold. There was a part of me, and it bothers me to say this, but there was a part of me that felt bad for him. But I think what I learned about that was my own stuff about feeling bad when I wanted to tell, or feeling bad for speaking. It wasn't really about Bill Cosby. So attending the trial was a step towards healing, because it forced me to look at another part of my history with feeling protective of my perpetrator and the enablers.
Yes.
There
Which is
were
which is a very common response, actually, isn't it? Especially when it's someone that's supposed to love you.
It's so normal. And again, the women that were in the courtroom testifying against Cosby, they didn't feel bad for him.
Yeah.
They hated him. They were sickened by him.
And what was so tough, because people have an opinion of who abuser looks like, or a rapist. We all grew up watching the Cosbys and loved the show, even in the UK across the pond from you. Can't be an actor, it can't be somebody like that, but yes, it can actually be somebody like that. The image that people have is not what they think. They are people that we know. They are famous actors. They are uncles or friends or neighbors or fathers or whoever.
Usually what I notice with perpetrators is they're multifaceted. There are obviously there are people out there that are just criminals who do horrible things, but in most cases, and this is where it gets complicated for us as survivors, you can like the person, this person can have lovable traits. Bill Cosby was a very talented man.
Yeah.
He had a way of charming people, and people really liked him. So I think that part of healing from abuse is also coming to terms with, there might be parts of your family member that you really loved, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that this person also wasn't really sick.
Yes, it's hard, isn't it? And so your book, at the moment I read it on a Kindle. I'm not sure I can see it behind you, so it must be available as a hardback. And soon, I think by the time we're aired, you'll be a paperback as well. So it's brilliant, really, because it's like a part memoir and a part self-help guide. And you share, it's really what I believe in. You share your story and you share other people's stories. And they're not just stories of abuse for people that are listening. It's people with PTSD from all different kind of reasons, that have been in wars or that have had people die or that have been abused as well. But I think it's very clever because it shows people that have been through trauma how they can find their way through. And for people that want to understand trauma as well, it shows them the messy healing journey that it is. But actually, even though it's tough and it's not easy to go through therapy and to find your way through it, there is an end point. There is hope. And that's what I really loved about your book.
That was why I wrote it. I wanted people to understand that while working through different types of trauma can be so painful and so complicated and long and frustrating, if we can stay in touch with why we're doing this. Oftentimes Dorothy would say to me, why do you think you're doing this? What is the point? And then I would write things down because I want to have a family, because I want to be happy. So I think it's so important for people to understand. And that's why I wrote the book, because I didn't want people to think it was happy ever after, because it's not happy ever after. It's happy and complicated and difficult. But yes, you can move into a life that's wonderful and amazing. And you can do the things that you thought you never would be able to do, like being a parent.
Absolutely. So just before we end up, I wondered if you have any advice for anyone that's listening that's maybe struggling to find their voice or thinking about going for therapy or in therapy at the moment. What would you say to someone that's listening?
I would just say, just keep reminding yourselves of what it is that you want, and keep thinking about that you have the ability and you have the right to reclaim your life. That if you want to feel safer in your body, if you want to trust other people, if you have goals and feel like the shame and the fear have been obstacles, to say to you, keep that image or that vision of what it is that you're wanting and keep it close by. And when you start to feel like, I can't do this anymore, it's too hard, make sure you turn to people that can be supportive. Like what I say is, we need sometimes to have people who can help us hold our pain, whether it's our therapist or our friends. If you're thinking that you want to face trauma, if you're thinking you want to go to therapy, make sure that as you're preparing to do that, that you set up a huge amount of support in whatever way that you can, because your therapist is not going to be the only person that can be there. You need to have an army behind you, and your army can include trees, dogs, anything, your Peloton. Your army does not always have to be just people.
Absolutely. Well, that's really all about self-care and self-worth and self-love, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a perfect place to end our interview. So, Shari, it just remains for me to thank you so much for sharing your story and showing us that you are not unbroken. None of us are broken beyond repair. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me and for all that you do for survivors and for your bravery and your courage and your voice.
You're welcome.
Unbroken, healing through storytelling.